Hello, and welcome to the Dance Physio Podcast, a podcast designed to explore ideas and foster discussion around dancer health and wellness. We're here to challenge the status quo, bridge the gap between dance science and the studio, and help change the landscape of the dance industry for the better. I'm your host, Erika Mayall, a dancer turned physiotherapist who is deeply passionate about leaving the dance world better than I found it. I'm so glad you're here. Let's get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Dance Physio Podcast. I am your host, Erika Mayall. This was not originally the podcast that I had planned to release this week, and I promise that one will be released in a coming week. But after the experience that I had yesterday at an adult dance convention here in the Vancouver area, I just had to share some of my experience at that event and some of the lessons we can learn from it and some of what I had the opportunity to talk to the dancers about at this event yesterday. So for a little bit of background, if you follow me on social media, and if you don't, go do that right now, at Dance Physio Erika, Erika with a K. If you follow me on social media, you may have seen that I have been posting a little bit about how I would be involved in an event called Untamed, and it was or is an adult dance convention. So think dance convention, same thing you would expect on kind of like the regular dance convention circuit. So hotel ballrooms, loads of classes throughout the day, different styles, like kind of pseudo celebrity guest instructors, all of the fun things about a dance convention that our adolescent and teenage dancers get to experience, but for dancers age 18 plus. And this event happened just outside of Vancouver in a suburb called Langley, and it was the brainchild of Natasha Mao, who is the director of an adult dance company in the area called Tris Dance Collective. And she was the mastermind behind this event, and it was such an incredible day. I cannot even explain to you the energy. In the rooms, plural, there were 2 ballrooms going, so one for sort of beginner intermediate level dancers and one for intermediate advanced level dancers. And just the vibes and the camaraderie and the energy, and it was such a positive experience. Part of what made it such an amazing experience was all the extra things that Tash had thought of to include in the event. So obviously there was the classes, and that was sort of like the main attraction, but there were also performances during the lunch break. And so she had different adult dance companies. So there was a heels dance company, there was an adult tap group, different genres of dance from different adult dance groups around the Lower Mainland area who came and performed. And it was so fun and such a vibe. And then there was also other little bits and bobs throughout, and I was fortunate enough to be able to come as Allegro Performance, which is my clinic name, and we set up a sort of recovery station, which I'll talk to you more about in a second. There was one of the local dancewear companies, Limbers, was there, and they were selling product. They had their heels. They had lots of different apparel and bodysuits, everything. I'm not even going to go into what they had, but Limbers was there. There was professional photographers. So there was photo shoot opportunities, which was really cool. There was just so much going on. It was such a high quality event. But like I said, the thing that made it really, really special was the vibes and the people who showed up, and the people who showed up ready to commit to 12 plus hours of dance on a Saturday in the middle of spring break here. And it was such an incredible event. So in addition to the recovery room or rehabilitation room or whatever we ended up calling it, I also had the opportunity to teach one of the classes and do a little bit of a kind of lecture workshop on we called it longevity in motion, but essentially longevity as an adult dancer. How do we make sure that as an adult dancer, our dance career can be sustainable? So I am going to get into a little bit of what I talked about in that kind of workshop, but I also just want to tell you a tiny bit about the recovery room that we had, because this was, I think, for me, the best part of the event. I obviously got to spend the day in the room. It was open door. We had loads of different recovery modalities. So we had compression boots with us. We had red light therapy. We had massage gun. We had foam rollers, balls, all the different kind of physio tools and gadgets. We had heating pads and all of that kind of thing. And dancers could come in between classes if they were sitting out a class or whatever and use any of those sort of recovery modalities to then be able to go and do their 7th class of the day or whatever it was. And dancers also got to come in and ask questions. We were not like assessing and treating injuries on site. It's just like not really viable at an event with, hundreds of people. So that was not the aim of what we were doing, but we were certainly answering questions. So people were coming in and sort of saying, oh, like, do you have a favorite hip flexor stretch or just things like that. So we got the opportunity to interact with loads of dancers. And by the end of the evening, I would say the recovery room was the place to be for a period of time there. We kind of had a bit of a packed house, and it was also a place that people were just coming to like decompress and chill out. And people were, bringing their food in, having a snack, using the compression boots, whatever it was. So it was really, really well utilized and just such good vibes. And so if you are somebody who organizes events or works in dance conventions or even competitions or things like that, I highly recommend, especially with the adult dance community. But honestly, I even think all of our younger dancers would benefit so much from this as well. Having some sort of recovery station on site where dancers can go and decompress and also just like have a little bit of like a sensory break from what's going on. Because if you've ever been to a convention, like, these are full on, these are intense. So yeah, I just loved being part of the event. And like I said, want to share a little bit with you about what we talked about in terms of longevity for adult dancers as well. So shout out to Tash. It was incredible. I'm still like riding the high from it, even though yesterday was like a really, really long day, and cannot wait for next year. So on to longevity in motion, or longevity for adult dancers. I think one of the reasons why I felt like this was an important topic to be able to cover at an event like this is that sometimes I think adult dancers assume or get told that they can't achieve the same levels as, say, their younger counterparts, or if you did not start dancing when you were a child, that you're not going to sort of attain high levels of dance. And this could not be further from the truth. Although, as an adult dancer, we do have to take care of and treat our bodies differently than younger dancers do. So adult bodies respond differently to training. They adapt to load differently than kids and teenagers. And so this is sort of what we were talking about, is how can we optimize this type of adaptation to make sure that as adult dancers, we are able to take care of our bodies. Also, for a lot of adult dancers, and again, this is not across the board, but for a lot of adult dancers, the goal is not always sort of technical perfection. The goal is often joy and longevity and community and finding yourself again and all sorts of other things that become the primary goal or the primary goals or drivers of participation in dance as an adult. And yes, we want to achieve high levels of technical skill and artistry and all of those types of things, but oftentimes the primary driver or primary goal has more to do with just being able to be active and be embodied and the joy that comes with it. That was the other cool thing about yesterday's event, although by the time you listen to this, it didn't happen yesterday. It was on the weekend. But anyway, the really cool thing about the Untamed convention was how many people were commenting that it was such a healing experience for them. People who had maybe attended conventions as younger dancers and felt like it was like a really competitive environment, and you were kind of like always trying to like push your way to the front and be seen and stand out, and all of that pressure that goes along with participating in a convention, especially as a younger dancer. That was not part of things yesterday. It was such a welcoming environment. There was no having to like push your way to the front. Everybody could participate to the level that they wanted. Like if you wanted to just be like kind of hanging around the sides or at the back, that was fine. If you wanted to just watch and sit out a class, that was fine. If you wanted to be front and center, like everything was accepted and encouraged. And so it was really cool to see that and to see how many people talked about it. Yeah, sort of being a healing experience. The other thing that was so cool too is there were so many dance parents there who talked about, like, I took my kid to dance conventions for years and always was like the one, you know, spending these long days at hotel ballrooms, but not actually getting to participate and just kind of being on the sidelines. And they were all like, yeah, this is my time. This is when I actually get to participate. So that was really cool as well. All right. I could literally talk about this forever, but I'm going to get into, again, the longevity. The other reason why I really wanted to cover this topic as part of the convention is that, again, I think there is this misconception that injuries are just like part of dancing as an adult. Like, oh, I'm old, I'm broken, I'm gonna get injured. It's like an inevitable part of dance. But age is not a predictor of injury. So that is something that we need to sort of like let go of. Age is not a predictor of injury. Lots of other things are predictors of injury, and we're going to talk about those, but age is not a predictor of injury. And so we can absolutely, as adult dancers, be healthy and dance kind of pain-free and injury-free if we think about how we're taking care of our bodies. The other thing that was really interesting, just in terms of that mindset, is a lot of the adults, or I shouldn't say a lot, some of the adults who were at this convention had grown up in dance, and some maybe had taken like a step back and then come back to it, 20 years later. Others had continued to dance, but a lot of people grew up in the era of dance where injuries were not treated the same way they are now, or taken as seriously or addressed. And it was sort of a little bit of that like no pain, no gain mentality, or this is just like being a broken dancer is part of like being a dancer. And so there was a lot of people carrying a lot of that kind of like, old injuries or things from when they were growing up dancing. And so, yes, absolutely, as adult dancers, we may have to address some of those things that are, a result of people having grown up in an era where dancer health and wellness was not known really to the same degree that it is now. And so something to consider, but I do think like the young dancers of today, if they continue on in dance, and hopefully they will, and continue to dance as adults, they will be in a far better place than a lot of adult dancers are currently. So I broke down this workshop into what I term the 5 pillars of longevity. And none of this is rocket science, and a lot of this is going to be stuff that you have heard me talk about on the podcast before, but we're coming at it from a lens of longevity as a dancer dancing into adulthood. So number 1, load management. You have heard me talk about load management so much. It is something that I am constantly sort of like harping on. But like I just said, age is not a predictor of injury, but load mismanagement is a predictor of injury. And you've probably heard me say this before, but oftentimes we see injuries happen from doing too much too soon after doing too little for too long. And that is obviously a very simplified quote. And this is something we need to be really aware of as adults, especially. And this absolutely holds true for younger dancers too, but especially as adults, if you've taken a massive break from dance, or maybe you have never danced before, and maybe you've not been super physically active in other, sports or athletic activities, you need to gradually build up your load tolerance for activities like dance. And what I see a lot with adult dancers that I work with, and the cool thing is like we're seeing this kind of like resurgence of adult dancers. And so a pretty significant proportion of clients in our clinic now are adult dancers. And what I often see is somebody tries a dance class, amazing. They fall in love and they're like, this is so cool. I loved it. It was great. And then all of a sudden they're like, okay, well now I'm going to take like this class and this class and this, and they just start to pile it on. And you're like, okay, so you went from having never danced or never really done any structured activity potentially to all of a sudden trying to take, 6 dance classes a week, let's say, or things like that. And so it's this sudden increase in loading, and that is what leaves dancers vulnerable to injury, not necessarily the fact that they are an adult, if that makes sense.
So we really want to think about load management. Our general recommendation for loading and loading increases, and this has to do with just like tissue adaptation, and we, sort of have the same recommendations when people are starting a gym program or any new athletic pursuit, is we want to generally see increases of about 10 to 20% per week. This is really, really, really hard in dance because we can't start by being like, okay, I'm going to take like one hour class, and then the next week I'm going to take like one hour and 10-minute class. You see where I'm going? Like, we have a really hard time increasing something by 10 to 20%. That being said, we can keep that goal in mind and know that we probably don't want to go from only ever dancing 1 hour a week to all of a sudden dancing 10 hours a week. Like, that is going to be too big of a jump. We want to try and increase things more slowly or more gradually than that. The other thing to keep in mind is loading. When we talk about like how we calculate load or what loading actually is on the body, it's a product of our duration and our frequency. So that would be like 1 hour per week or 3 hours per week. So duration and frequency, but it is also a product of intensity. And so that is probably the variable that is easiest for us to have some effect on. I mean, certainly frequency as well. So like I said, we don't want to go from dancing like once a week to all of a sudden dancing 6 times a week necessarily. We want to slowly increase that. But we can also have an effect on intensity. So we can think about, okay, if I'm going to increase hours sort of quote unquote dramatically or more than that 10 to 20% recommendation, which most people are, if you're going from 1 class to 2 class, that's more than 10%. We can think about, okay, how intense are these classes going to be? Or how can I modify some of the intensity as I'm building up my tolerance to that? And so do I need to do all of those classes, 110%? Or can I think about how I can like modify the intensity a little bit or take one class that's more intense and one class that's a lot less intense to try and modify some of that loading. So first pillar of longevity, load management. Second pillar of longevity, warming up. Again, not something you've not heard me talk about before. I've talked about warm up and we have podcast episodes specifically on warm up. I will link that in the show notes if you want to learn more about how to design an effective warm up. I'm not going to go through all of that right now, but adult dancers can still use the ramp protocol that, like I said, I've talked about pretty extensively. The difference with adult dancers versus potentially younger dancers is that oftentimes warm-up needs to be longer for adult dancers. It takes longer for the body to have the physiological adaptations that we are looking for when we are warming up. So things like that, increasing heart rate, increasing respiratory rate, increased blood flow, joint lubrication, all of the things that are part of warming up properly, the body's going to just take a little bit longer to respond to that. So if you're an adult dancer, you need to set aside more time to make sure that you're like arriving, with adequate time before class to warm yourself up properly, things like that. But then also, if you are a teacher and you are teaching adults, you also need to be aware that your warm-up likely needs to be a little bit longer and probably a little bit more gradual as well. If we're using the RAMP protocol, and that R stands for raise your heart rate, anytime I'm doing like workshops on this, we're always sort of like brainstorming ideas of, okay, what types of things can we use to raise our heart rate? So, people are throwing out ideas like jumping jabs, like jogging around the studio, running on the spot, like those types of things. All great ideas. But if you have a group of adult dancers and all of a sudden they're coming into the studio and you're starting to start off with like jumping jacks for 5 minutes, that is probably too intense of a ramp up. Like, we want to be a little bit more slow and gradual about how we increase the intensity of what it is we're doing. So maybe we start with like marching on the spot, and then we take that into like little prances, and then it turns into a little bit of a jog on the spot, and then so you can see what I mean, like just this little bit more slow and gradual warm up, and then a longer duration overall of a warm up, because adult bodies are just going to take a little tiny bit longer to respond to what it is we want them to do. Number 3, in terms of pillars of longevity, strength. Again, You've heard me talk about this before. And we know from research that dance class alone is not enough to meet the strength demands or to build strength to meet the strength demands required by dancers. And this probably also holds true for adult dancers. The one thing that I will say is if we have people coming to dance who have not previously danced, or like I sort of was describing before, people who maybe have not been super physically active. This is their first time where they're like, oh, I found a structured activity that I really, really love. They actually probably will build strength because it is going to be, more demanding than maybe where their physical capacity or physical levels were previously. But at some point when we're doing something consistently enough, our body will stop adapting to it in the same way. So in strength training, there's this principle that we use that's called progressive overload. And the idea is that we always need to be progressively pushing the body a little bit further in order for the body to sort of be prompted to adapt to those loads and to then build more strength. And so again, at the beginning, dance class might actually be really, really helpful for people to build strength. But at some point when we have people who want to dance for longer or dance with higher intensity or like longer durations and things like that, we likely need to be addressing some amount of strength training outside of the studio. This is especially important, again, not just for dancers, but for humans in general. Strength training is especially important as we age for things like maintaining bone health and maintaining metabolic health. And so this is not just be strong for dance so we don't get injured, although that might be your main motivator. It is also be strong for life so that we can live as long as possible. So strength is super, super important, and you may not be getting adequate strength in class to see the adaptations that we want to see. So you might have to consider what it is you're doing outside of the studio in terms of incorporating some strength training. Strength is also often, or like a base level of strength is often an underlying requirement for certain technique in dance. And so again, if people aren't meeting that basic kind of like level of strength, then they're maybe not going to be able to execute the technique in the way that we want in order for it to be the safest way for them to be able to execute it. So sometimes the strength that we're talking about is going to be linked back to technique, but we can also think about it just from overall injury prevention and longevity as well. All right, pillar number 4. Mobility. And I'm very intentionally using the word mobility rather than flexibility because they are not the same thing. And again, I've covered this in the podcast before. So if you're like, I actually didn't know that there was a difference between mobility and flexibility, I will link that episode in the show notes here and you can go back and kind of listen to that and learn a little bit more about that. But when we're talking about mobility, we are talking about the body's ability to move through ranges of motion and to move through ranges of motion with control. So sometimes you'll hear me refer to this as active mobility. And again, for our adult dancers, we really want to focus a lot on mobility. And especially if we have a lot of people, and this conversation was coming up a lot yesterday at Untamed, people who were like, I have a desk job. I am a desk gremlin. I sit for 10, 12 hours a day at a desk. And then I get up and all of a sudden want and expect my body to be able to move in certain ways for dance. Like, what do I do? And so when we have people who maybe, have occupations and stuff that are not centered around dance, but then dance is their hobby, it's their passion outside, we want to make sure that we're addressing any mobility limitations that might develop from whatever occupation they might be in. And so this could be people with desk jobs, but this could also be somebody with some sort of other physical labor type job, but that is different than how we move our body as a dancer. So again, we want to think about mobility and think about how can we make sure that we are working on mobility of all of our major joints and taking those through full ranges of motion and full controlled ranges of motion. The other thing to kind of pay attention to is mobility. Changes in mobility, or increasing or improving mobility, takes longer as an adult. And part of it is because of all those other things, like maybe we sit at a desk all day. And so then when you come in and work on the mobility, you might not see changes as quickly as you did when you were a kid. And you're like, oh, I did a stretch for a week and now I've improved my, whatever mobility or flexibility. So we need to recognize that and make sure that we are honoring that and not pushing our bodies too far, and sort of be accepting of the fact that change will happen, but it takes longer to happen. And then we also need to make sure that we are paying attention to and cognizant of how the nervous system impacts mobility and controls mobility. And again, this is a topic that I've talked about lots. I will link some resources in the show notes for you about that as well. But as adult dancers, we have potentially a lot more going on in our lives, and our nervous system may be more overwhelmed or more dysregulated compared to younger dancers. And so when we think about how the nervous system impacts mobility and how it influences our mobility, we may need to spend a lot more time actually working on nervous system regulation techniques before we can even get into some of the other mobility work that we want to work on. So again, we're not talking about just flexibility for adult dancers. We really want to think about it as like mobility and pay attention to how the nervous system is going to have an impact on that. And then fifth pillar of longevity for adult dancers is making sure that we are prioritizing rest and recovery. And this is probably the part that is the hardest for adult dancers that I work with. And I think there are obviously multiple reasons for that, but a lot of adult dancers are parents, you have careers, you have other obligations outside of dance. And so prioritizing rest and recovery can become really tricky. Rest and recovery, first sort of most important part of that is sleep and making sure we're getting adequate sleep. And again, this is something that a lot of adults are going to struggle with and going to feel like they're not necessarily able to achieve that, but it does have a huge impact on rest and recovery. And then things like hydration and nutrition and all of those pillars. And again, I've talked about rest and recovery on the podcast before. I will also link that episode in the show notes. But as an adult dancer, we want to make sure that we are still hitting those pillars. I think sometimes there's like a misconception that if you're not, dancing 40 hours a week, that the rest and recovery piece of things is not as important, but it is absolutely just as important. And especially like in an aging body, we might take a little bit longer to recover from strenuous activity. And so we want to make sure that we are prioritizing that. So those are the 5 kind of pillars of longevity that we talked about. And we talked more in depth about these at the event yesterday, but I just wanted to cover them quickly because a lot of them I do have podcast episodes on. But as adult dancers, I think if we can think about those 5 pillars, so load management, making sure we're warming up adequately and spending enough time warming up, strength, whether that is strength training outside of dance or just making sure we have adequate strength for the dance that we're participating in, mobility, and really understanding and honoring how the nervous system is going to play a role in the mobility we have in our body, as well as recovery and making sure that we are providing the most optimal environment for our body to be able to rest and recover both outside of dance. If we can focus on those 5 key pillars, that is really going to go so far in terms of longevity in the dance world and being able to continue to dance at high levels for as long as we want to be able to dance. So I hope that you found that helpful if you are an adult dancer or potentially you are a teacher who works with adult dancers. I know that there are a lot of dance parents that listen to this podcast episode. So if you're a dance parent and maybe you never have taken a dance class yourself and you watch your kids dance and you think like, oh yeah, looks like they're having a lot of fun, I highly, highly, highly encourage you to go and take a class if it's something that you've always wanted to do. It is never too late to go and try a class. And if yesterday's event was any indicator, adult dancers are alive and thriving, and the adult dance community really is exploding right now. And certainly in the Vancouver area, we've just seen such an increase in all levels of adult dance. So whether that's like truly, truly beginner, never taken a dance class ever in your life, up to people who are coming back into dance after having taken 20 years off of dance, or people who have continued to dance at really high levels and are just sustaining these professional careers. There is so much availability, and I would highly encourage you to go and try a class if you have not. It really is one of the best communities out there. So that is all I have to say on that today. Thank you so much for listening, and I would really appreciate it if you share today's episode with an adult dancer in your life who you want to make sure can continue dancing for as long as possible. Thank you so much for listening today, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.